Hey, everybody. Welcome to Inside the Courtroom. I'm Erica Stapleton here with Katie Wilcox. And big question, Katie, will she or won't she testify? We are referring to Lori Vallow Daybell in her murder conspiracy trial here in Arizona. And yeah, that's a big question, although she's leaning no as of today.
As of yesterday, she said she wasn't going to. She said she rests her case. And it seems like the next thing that we are right now at least expecting to hear from her is her closing argument. So let's talk a little bit about whether or not she would testify. I think, you and I have thought about this. We've heard some of the, pros and cons to that. It seems like one of the big problems that she could face is what that could open the door to.
Yeah. And, it felt like leading up to all of this, because in hearings and even throughout the trial, she's been pushing to bring in an expert, to keep certain witnesses on her list that the state wanted to strike, or maybe she didn't subpoena properly or didn't have enough time to. So that was the big question is, it felt like she wanted to put on a case. And even in her opening statements, she said, the evidence will show, the evidence will show, the evidence will show. And it made it sound like that maybe she would put forth some evidence, but perhaps she was just referring to the state's evidence, who has put on a case so far. Right. And that is, it is their burden of proof. Lori Vallow Daybell does not have to put on anything.
And she has cross-examined almost every witness.
Yes.
Maybe she feels satisfied with that. And it's not clear exactly what she's feeling, but obviously she has, tried to raise doubt with what they were saying. She's tried to raise issues about, you think this was what I was doing, but couldn't it have been this? Isn't this just as good of an explanation for why things happened the way they did?
Yeah.
And really push back on, it seems like the self-defense is her main argument.
Yes. And that's what she's been saying throughout this. That's what her brother said on day one when, this all unfolded. And to give people to give people just the background here, Lori Vallow Daybell is being accused of conspiring with her brother, Alex Cox, to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow. She was married to Charles Vallow up until he died in July 2019 when her brother shot and killed him. And basically what the state has been laying out is that they conspired and essentially lured him inside the house that day so they could kill him. And they laid out it took a long time for Alex Cox to call 911. Lori took his phone and, went off with it. She went to drop their son JJ off at school and stopped at Burger King and went to Walgreens to buy flip-flops. So just unusual behavior that we heard throughout all this testimony. And
and what I'll say is it seems a lot like, that day of the shooting, the day that Charles Vallow was killed, there wasn't a ton of disagreement, right? Lori, agrees that Alex Cox shot him. She more or less, agrees that she went to the Burger King and that they bought the flip-flops and, she didn't really talk about the 45-minute wait around to not help him, but she tried to raise some doubt about whether or not it's possible they could have given him CPR, right? She tried to push back on that testimony. So when it comes to that issue, it didn't seem like there was a ton of question. It's pretty clear, cut and dry. Alex Cox shot Charles Vallow.
Yeah,
the question
why
is why, exactly.
Yeah, the why and how
did they
premeditated was it? Exactly.
And when it comes to the premeditation, I'm wondering, from your perspective, especially being in the courtroom every day, how much do you think she was able to really challenge that idea that she and her brother did conspire to do this and they planned it out ahead of time?
I think she tried to refute that notion or that allegation that they conspired to do this essentially at every turn, because it felt like she was cross-examining most witnesses. It felt like, to me, observing, she would kind of push back on the witnesses that maybe didn't have the most striking evidence against her, or if they did, she didn't really get into those text messages that we'll get into in a moment. But it's interesting because this trial compared to her trial in Idaho, and, further backstory on this case, Vallow Daybell has already been convicted of killing her children in Idaho and conspiring to kill her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy. So a long history here, and the jury doesn't know any of that. And there were little clues throughout the trial that, of course, people in the media who have been covering this for years, like we have, and, people who have been following this case, a lot of community members from Idaho coming here to Arizona to really watch in, they know all of that. And the jury does not. They're not privy to that. They're not supposed to. And it wasn't something that was properly introduced in this case. And what's interesting is that, just before we get into her interaction with the judge this morning, I just want to point out the differences between her Idaho case, where she did have a public defender. She had people representing her. They also didn't present any evidence in that case, but she did have someone else asking questions. She sat there pretty silently until, as you point out, I know it's such a striking moment. The first time we really heard from her and what kind of was going through her head was when she was sentenced in Idaho, getting 3 life sentences. And what do you remember about that?
I think that some of it just stands out so clearly. And I remember it almost being like a gut punch of a moment, because she talked about the way that, JJ has flourished as a grown-up in heaven. And it's so disturbing, because ultimately she had just been convicted of killing her son, and she was like leaning into these religious beliefs that she said guided everything that she had done, and basically almost made it sound like things are better off for that family now, in my memory of what she was saying that day. And I just remember, especially in this newsroom, we all kind of sat there like, oh, how, what? And I know even since the beginning of us looking at this case, she hasn't acted like that. She's really moved the needle, or tried to push away from, my beliefs aren't outside the realm of, normal LDS things, like, oh, this issue of Nephi, there's lots of stories of Nephi. That's not that bizarre. But what she said at her sentencing, it was beyond bizarre. I mean, it was awful. And again, she has been sentenced to multiple life sentences. I think that people would say there was justice served in that case. It does look and sound different than what we've been hearing from her.
Yeah.
Here.
And it makes you wonder how methodical that is, because, and I know I've talked with this, about this with Andrea on Inside the Courtroom, is that you almost see different versions of her depending on who she's talking to, depending on what's being talked about. And at some points, it feels like she's presenting herself as kind of meek, timid to the jury, and then you hear her push back and get really feisty with some of these witnesses. And
argumentative,
argumentative. And just to set the scene, the state rested its case just yesterday.
Yes.
And essentially, the jury left the courtroom at that point in time, and the judge asked Vallow Daybell, who, again, is representing herself here in Arizona, what she intends to do. And eventually, she tells him she wants to rest too. But because the jury was not in there, she hasn't officially done it yet. That's just her intention, and that's what everyone's expecting at this point in time. But the jury doesn't know that. So they were sent home, and it was decided that Monday will be the day for closing arguments. And she essentially has until Monday to change her mind, although the judge said, you better let us know sooner, because that will change the jury instructions. So it sounded like she could maybe, she sounded a little wishy-washy there, but that no was really a surprise, I think.
So
initially.
What happened today?
So today, both sides met without the jury. They met with the judge to go over those jury instructions to kind of figure out what they're going to say. And the first thing the judge asked was, what are you going to do? And you could tell by her tone that, maybe the door is still open there. Take a listen.
Is it still your intention to not put on any evidence?
Right now, Your Honor, yes. As of this morning, I mean.
Well, do you anticipate that changing?
No.
All right.
Yeah, right now, as of this morning. Well, do you anticipate that changing? I don't know. Her no didn't sound absolutely definitive, but again, what could she bring to the table that would either help her case, or, I don't know, could she actually hurt her case, depending on who she tried to bring on the stand?
Well, I think most experts tell anybody, don't represent yourself.
Right.
So
True.
that's, I think that's the bottom line. I think that's the advice a lot of attorneys would give. But here she is doing just that.
Sure.
And so maybe that's why. Maybe she doesn't think, taking the stand or bringing in a witness will help her case at this point. Just seeing how, she's navigated through this court process. There were, as she tried to be, as you said, argumentative with some of these witnesses, she would get objections lobbed at her from the prosecution, and a lot of them would be sustained by the judge. The judge had to tell her multiple times,
ask another question,
or like, you can't say that, move on. She was accused of trying to testify by, kind of giving statements before asking questions, or just giving leading statements, bringing up things that hadn't been introduced yet and were never going to be introduced in this case. So maybe she took that experience and made this decision based on that.
It could be that she really is leaning into thinking that she has done her best, that she has already, to the best of her ability, poked holes in the prosecutor's case. And ultimately, when you're the defense, that's all you really have to do, right, is raise that reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Now, let's kind of shift into what the prosecutors did bring to the table.
Yeah.
Because the prosecutors brought in people who knew her. They brought in people who knew Charles. They brought in, obviously, the detectives who really laid out not just what was happening that day, but like we were saying, all of the plot that appeared to be a plot beforehand, and then messages after the fact that, again, seemed like they had planned this out.
Yeah, and a lot of these messages, you're saying text messages, I feel like that was some of the strongest evidence they had, because it really, you could see some of the interactions between Lori and her brother, calling Charles a zombie, a Z, which is, a term that we come to learn means someone is possessed. They have an evil spirit in them. We heard other people testify that that's what Lori told them. We know from our reporting and learning in this trial that she was involved with a religious group, people who had, thoughts about the ends of times, doomsday beliefs. That's where Chad Daybell comes in. He's a doomsday writer. And it sounded like from the moment they met, things just took off on this. They went off on this alternate path. And that's ultimately, again, what the prosecutor is saying in the grand scheme of things, that's what fueled Lori Vallow Daybell to get rid of her husband. And then we know in Idaho, get rid of her kids and get rid of Chad's first wife so they could be together.
Well, and it's interesting, I think back on some of the big moments of testimony, and I think about Katie Wilcox and frankly, Adam, her brother Adam, who is still alive, and that they both know what she's already been convicted of. They both know that they've lost Tylee and JJ, and of course, Tammy Daybell, but they bring that in and weren't allowed to talk about it on the stand. But you could see some moments where it colored what they were thinking. And I think Adam Cox was the most clear when he just said, point blank, there is no doubt in my mind that she conspired with Alex Cox to kill Charles. And I just wonder how much the jury will sit there and think about that moment.
Yeah, and there were a lot of moments, I think, especially when you bring in these family members. I think that's really telling when you have
her own
brother testify against you. And it was, pretty jarring to see her cross-examine him because she came up and said, Mr. Cox. Like, it's as if it felt so weird. And I think the jury picks up on those moments too. And, we saw this discomfort, not just with her brother, not just with Katie Wilcox, but with a lot of the investigators. And,
absolutely.
We heard a lot of the same story from the investigators that Alex Cox waited 45 plus minutes to call 911. They brought in the people involved in life insurance because Charles Vallow changed his policy to his sister, Katie Wilcox, because he was worried about how Lori was behaving. He was worried for himself, and we know he was worried for Tylee and JJ too.
But it's got to be so difficult for these investigators, right? Because obviously when this case first came to them, Tylee and JJ were still alive. And I think in looking back on it, I'm sure it's so much more difficult, but because they now see this entire case in a somewhat of a new light as well. And obviously that day, we got to see some of the video of how they interacted with her that same day, that she was nonchalant, that she didn't seem to be like panicking or, devastated by
it was the
shooting.
Same testimony over and over and over.
Over and over and over. And still, however, though, what we do know is that at that time, charges weren't pressed at that time. It was treated like maybe a self-defense case in that moment. And, unfortunately, the series of horrifying events that happened afterwards, really put this case into just kind of, a gut-wrenching situation.
No, and I talked about this with prosecutor Rachel Smith. She was involved in the Idaho case. She came in as kind of a special, counsel to work with that team in Idaho. And I asked her, do you think anyone could have acted differently here? And she said, no, I don't think anyone could have predicted where this case would go, especially in this moment when you see, Charles is dead, killed by Alex. But you could tell that from testimony during this current trial that people had been worried, and they were like, oh, she, maybe said a statement about that, or she said she wanted to kill her husband, but then it actually happened.
Well, let's get right to that. I mean, ultimately, one of the things that was said is like Adam Cox and frankly Charles Vallow were there possibly, we think, to have an intervention.
Oh, yeah.
Because they were concerned about her and how she was acting and whether or not she could be a threat to herself, to the kids, to anybody else.
Yeah. So essentially walking up to that day, and why we say the state is alleging Charles was kind of lured into this, is that he and Lori were estranged at this time, still married, but he was in Houston and came in that day, and he actually paid for Adam to come in with him. Right. Adam, who essentially had a strange relationship with his family too. And they came in, he said his other brother, Alex, who's, accused of conspiring with Lori to do this. I'll mention that he can't be charged because he passed away before charges were filed in any of these cases.
Right.
But he said his brother was acting weird. We know from text messages now that it sounds like Lori and Alex were plotting something. Investigators said Alex brought a loaded gun essentially to Lori's house with her kids there
and extra
magazines. Yeah. So it's a tough reality. And then just that morning, up until that point, we have Adam Cox and Charles talking about they're plotting something. And so they knew something was going on, but I don't think anyone predicted the harm that this would cause. And
Right.
you want to go back to that moment. I think Adam Cox's testimony was so powerful.
Right.
And hearing from him, because we haven't heard him testify on the stand in this way before. And just some of his, piecing all of this together for him, I think the jury probably really resonated with those moments. So I want you to take a listen.
When you were talking to your family after this happened, did you actually tell them that you believed that Lori and Alex had conspired to kill Charles?
Yes.
Why was that?
Because Lori had told people that Charles was no longer living, that some guy named Ned was inside of his body, that there was a zombie living inside of him. And Alex didn't respond to any of my text messages when I was supposed to be with him. And he was at that house that morning. Lori talking crazy about how she's a translated being. All these things all added up into that moment and that morning. Once I found out on Saturday that Charles was shot and killed, no doubt on my mind that they killed him.
Yeah, that's exactly the moment that stands out in my head, the no doubt in my mind. And it's just, again, it gets into this really interesting situation and all these strange family dynamics. And again, bringing up people who either were in the room or were especially not in the room. I mean, how do you think that something like that, we talked a little bit about it, but is going to play out?
When we heard from Adam, he mentioned they have a sister. He mentioned their parents, and they are being him and Lori's parents. And it's interesting because these are people we thought were on Lori's witness list.
Yeah.
Her sister and her parents. The state said they may have minimal relevance here, so they weren't stricken. So it was possible that she could have called them in. And it sounds like, after hearing from Adam, that after all of this really unfolded, he doesn't have a good relationship with his family anymore.
Right.
But, these aren't just the only fringe, I'll say, family members that came into play. We heard when the state was bringing up its evidence, we heard of people like Melanie and Brandon and
Sure.
Zach. And Zach, I'll set the stage for folks here. Zach is Adam Cox's son, Lori's nephew. And then Brandon is Lori's niece's ex-husband. I know that's a long string there. And then Melanie is her niece. So Melanie and Brandon were married, and they're actually, part of this next case that she's facing in Arizona. But the jury, I feel like, heard about some of these names from the state without a lot of context. And I wonder if that may be confusing for them.
You know what, Erica, I think it is confusing, but I also just think ultimately the entire plot of whatever Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell thought they were going to do, it doesn't make any sense to me.
No.
And ultimately, I guess that's all that really matters, is that I'm not sure what they were plotting. I'm not sure why they moved to Idaho. I'm not sure if they thought they were going to, grow some following, if it was something really, I don't know, because none of those things make sense for the trail of bodies.
No, and also none of them happened, which is
right.
Obviously, whatever mission they thought they were on, they being Chad and Lori, is they're both spending the rest of their life in prison. Chad sentenced to death.
Right.
That's none of this is happening. None of what they wanted happened. And
so I'm not sure if, all these names, yes, it is confusing. I think it's a little bit confusing, but I think that the prosecutor, at least listening even to just the little bit that she was able to say yesterday afternoon, and kind of just a very brief recap of everything that she presented, I think the prosecutor feels confident that she was able to make a strong enough case, and that while there are other characters who maybe didn't make it into the courtroom and who didn't help explain this, I think the prosecutor very much feels like
she did enough.
She's done enough.
Yeah. And, I will say, having covered this and knowing there's more to this story than what was presented in this narrow case, I was surprised that how quickly this wrapped up from the prosecution's end. Yeah. I was. And, she started this week by saying we could end this week. And so we were prepared for it. But I was surprised, and we've talked about this moment before, but I was surprised we didn't see that body camera footage from Gilbert Police around the time of Charles talking, on camera, telling officers that she's gone crazy, and she being Lori, and that he was afraid for himself. She said, she's going to murder me. She's afraid of, he fears for the kids. And then he also tells them in that moment that I'm taken over by some guy named Ned. That's what she's telling me. And that came up too. But
that does seem like a strange things to leave out, especially knowing what we know.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to interview this prosecutor after the fact and kind of ask,
absolutely,
why not include that? I mean, maybe because, I don't know. I wonder why.
Well, and, some thoughts we've had in just discussing this, because I think that was a big piece, because it almost sounds like Charles predicted what happened ultimately. So you feel like, and again, we're not prosecutors, so we don't know the methodology, and I agree it would be great to talk to the prosecutor about this, but I was surprised not to see that. And then when you name some of these people like Melanie and Brandon, I was surprised maybe to not hear more about them or more from them, because Melanie in particular was so intertwined in a lot of this. Never charged, I'll make that clear, but she was Lori's niece and involved in some of these events that we heard about throughout the trial.
And it felt like her statements and some of the information that she presented to police had maybe an initial, impact on the police presenting this case in the first place.
Yeah.
Or at least it appeared that way, again, to us, not being in the prosecutor's office.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, I agree with you that the bottom line is that the state is really confident in this case, especially because it feels like Vallow Daybell is kind of shot down at every turn, especially on her cross-examination, if we want to kind of unpack all that we've seen over the past couple weeks here.
She had so many opportunities, and, again, I think she cross-examined almost every single one of them, maybe with one person that she didn't cross.
I think one or two she did not, if I'm remembering.
So she is doing this. And again, I felt like at some points it seemed like she really knew what the rules were, and she was maybe sometimes trying to follow the rules, but she would seem to push the envelope until it resulted in one of those,
an objection, or, the judge almost scolding her. And
seriously,
again, the court or the jury, like, they pick up on that. Although I will say this, it almost seemed like there was a lot of the days the courtroom was packed, and some of the, her line of questioning to some people, like there were some like gasp moments from the gallery, but not necessarily the jury. It felt like the jury was attentive in a lot of ways, taking notes. And we see throughout that they're able to ask questions, and they did ask questions of several witnesses. But I didn't see from the jury any, jaw-dropping moments or any, so again, I'm just wondering how, everything's landed with them, and hopefully we get the chance to interview some jurors after the fact too.
Again, this case is about trying to get justice for Charles Vallow. And I think, you talked to that prosecutor before, whom I thought made a very clear point that just, yes, she's already been convicted to multiple life sentences. She will serve the rest of her life in prison. But that doesn't mean that the other people who she may have also harmed shouldn't get justice too.
No, and there's unfortunately a trail almost of people who have been killed in this case, but there's also a trail of living victims. And we saw throughout, this case, Lori's oldest son, Colby, he was in the courtroom several days. He said he wanted to be there to support Katie Wilcox, who is Charles's sister, J.J. Vallow's grandmother. And it's almost as if the people who have been affected by Lori, Chad, and Alex Cox are have almost formed this bond. We saw investigators from Idaho who came down to watch parts of this trial. And I think it just shows that these people really did take a toll on so many communities, and the ripple effect is still there.
I mean, there was, one person who we got to hear from that I think was pretty shocking, and she was someone who was developing a relationship with Charles Vallow.
Yeah.
And, she talked to the prosecutor about Charles unloading on her, like her knowing, I guess what she was really trying to bring to the table is some of that stuff we were just talking about, that Charles had said he was concerned, that Charles was worried about how Lori could behave, what might happen. And then, Lori kind of took some swings.
Yeah, this was really shocking testimony to hear. And it's someone we hadn't really heard from before. You're referring to Nancy Joe Hancock. Right. And she is someone who met Charles Vallow, online leading up to his visit to Phoenix, or the Phoenix area, to Chandler. And they ultimately, went out on a date the night before he was ultimately killed. And, she said he was a great guy, and they talked a lot. They talked on the phone, and he did share a lot of his struggles with his relationship with Lori. But she also said she was surprised at how maybe compassionate he was, given the situation that he was in with her. And I think this witness was brought in two-part, to not, to share what she knew about the case, but also maybe put Charles in a light that we haven't heard, because we hear from his sister, but we don't hear from a lot of people who knew Charles. And I think the people, looking at this case, a lot of times it's, the grand scheme is about the kids. And that's what Lori, from
Lori's perspective, she's trying to paint. Yeah.
And she tried to do that at many points throughout her cross-examination too. And at one point, the, state objected, saying, "You're smearing the victim." So she's really pushing hard to try and make it seem like Charles was the aggressor. That's what she's claiming. The state obviously has a different story. And Nancy Joe,
clearly had a different story.
Clearly, said what she had to say. And I think, she was one of maybe the most memorable witnesses they could have called to the stand. And then we also got more memorable moments when Lori herself was cross-examining her. So take a listen.
Do you go on dates with married men? Naturally?
Argumentative. I'm going to also object under 611 for harassment.
So are you trying to tell me and this jury that you went on one date with my husband and he told you all the details of our lives?
I'm telling you the truth, and that's what I know.
So you spent your whole date getting to know each other, talking about me?
Don't flatter yourself. No, we did not spend the whole time talking about you.
I mean, you have to think, though, that if you were in a relationship with someone who was going through a divorce with Lori Vallow Daybell or Lori Vallow at the time, they might want to offload some of that information.
Yeah.
That was a really tough back and forth.
But the don't flatter yourself. The way people in the gallery sucked in to try to that moment. And it was
how awful.
It was so awful. This is, again, I'm just saying this to, again, show the attention on this case, but there have already been t-shirts made saying don't flatter yourself.
Oh my goodness.
Based on this trial.
I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense, right? Because
it was such a strong moment in court. And again, not necessarily a piece of evidence, but
it feels like something that will stick with you. And again, thinking about how the jury will deliberate, hopefully they're going to focus on, of course, the facts of the case, but you can't really separate your emotions from it. And you can't really separate how you were feeling when something like that is going to happen. So I think about, as they look at that and they see that moment, they're getting a glimpse of her personality. But again, like we've talked about, how much are they really going to get to know about her past? What can they know at this point?
Not much. And basically what they know in the narrow vein of this case is that she was married to Charles Vallow, and then he died, and then she moved on and married Chad Daybell 4 months later, is essentially the crux of everything.
And ultimately, in that 4 months, Tammy Daybell also dies.
Yes.
Does the jury get to know that?
No. They don't know that. They did, although Tammy's name did come up yesterday in testimony, because Charles, we learned, through these messages and through investigators going through their iCloud accounts after the fact, that Charles knew Lori and Chad Daybell were having an affair, and he actually confronted them and also tried to reach out to Tammy about this. But
I think that, it's interesting when Nancy Joe Hancock came in, is what I guess I'm trying to say, is that she came in even before we had heard some of these messages that Lori sent to Chad Daybell. And so yesterday we spent a lot of time listening to this whole, affirmations of love, text messaging back and forth in the, days, frankly, after Charles died. Yeah. And I wonder if it would have been what it could have been different if we had heard from Nancy Joe Hancock after that. It seems like Lori Vallow Daybell in that exchange that we just listened to was taking swings at Nancy Joe for dating a married man.
Yes.
But now we have this other side of the picture that Lori was not in a serious relationship with Charles Vallow at the time. She was in a relationship with Chad Daybell.
Yeah. And I think that juxtaposition is, it's interesting. And we talked about this too with the order in which the state presented its case, because I do think it maybe would have been helpful to see some of those text messages sooner. They ended with that because I do think it is the strongest evidence. But
again, we're not prosecutors, but we are
not by
in the news, and we have to structure stories all the time. And we do talk about how we're going to relay things and what way they're going to come out. And so, again, it is not the same as prosecuting a trial in any way. I'm not trying to say that. But as I watch and listen to this, I am really curious about how both of them will sum up all the evidence that we heard in these last 2 weeks in those closing arguments, because ultimately that's what prosecutors really get to do.
Yeah.
And frankly, Lori Daybell will get to do this herself, is make their own conclusions. You really try to tie all the strings together in those closing arguments, which we're going to get to next week.
Well, and it's interesting because when they gave their opening statements, that's really the first time, there's discovery in these cases, and the state has to disclose who they want to call. She has to disclose, she being Lori needs to disclose who she wants to, so there are these disclosures, but you don't exactly know what each side is going to say specifically.
Right.
So hearing that argument, I think she can now kind of formulate, she knows what's been laid out against her fully at this point. She knows what maybe she felt landed in court and maybe didn't land in court by the way she asked questions. So I think we'll certainly see an interesting, I don't want to say performance, but I think we'll see something really interesting from her come Monday. But, the big question still remains, will she change her mind about taking the stand?
Ultimately, I mean, just looking back on, you were in the courtroom every day of testimony since last Monday. How do you think the state navigated this case?
I think this is a really tough case to navigate given all the history. And I think they were very careful to, stay in the vein of Charles Vallow because they don't want to do anything that could jeopardize the, state of the trial or possibly appeal. There's so many things that could come after the fact that, if you don't put on a good case there, you can poke holes, there could be appeals.
Right.
There are a lot of issues that could arise if a case is not done properly. And we've seen with Lori Vallow Daybell, she's appealing her case in Idaho. We've seen her try to get this dismissed like multiple times. So I feel like she's going to keep fighting tooth and nail to not be charged in this case, not to have a conviction in this case. And again, we don't know what will come. We don't know what the jury's going to decide at this point. But I do think they had a tough job, they being the prosecution, had a tough job navigating this. And I think they presented a lot of evidence and they connected a lot of dots and they presented, quite frankly, a lot of alarming and concerning things as it relates to Lori, Alex, and Chad Daybell. And Chad Daybell, too, I'll point out that charges were submitted for him. The county attorney's office did not choose to prosecute. And typically when they do that, they say that because it's not,
no
unlikeliness of conviction, which may be the case. And that's, maybe more of the challenge with conspiracy cases. But, I do think they ultimately put a lot out there. And I think her behavior, her being Lori's behavior in court, didn't help her.
No, I agree. I don't think it helped her just based on, what I've seen. And again, knowing what we know obviously colors what I'm aware of more so than a jury will know, obviously. But I think that what the jury does know, just again, based on only what was said while they were in the courtroom, it shows
it's an alarming case.
It's an alarming case. And it shows that, she apparently wanted this life insurance. It shows that she was in some way expecting Social Security payments. And it shows that she was in a relationship with Chad Daybell and that she and her brother had conversations before about maybe something that might indicate that they wanted to kill Charles Vallow.
And they were both there when Charles Vallow was killed, and they didn't immediately get help. And it was only Alex Cox who called 911. Lori never called anybody.
And so did Lori poke enough holes in that story?
That's the question. That's the question for the jury. And again, she has that narrow window to maybe bring something forth herself. Again, the inclination sounds like she's not going to, but it's going to be a long weekend. We'll see what happens. But I do want to point out, too, before we wrap this up a little bit, that the biggest question I think we hear on this live stream is, does the jury know about Tylee and JJ? And they do in the sense that they were brought up as her kids. They were part of this case, but they don't know that the kids are dead, or at least it wasn't clearly said that the kids are dead or that Lori is convicted of killing them. And what may factor in, and we talked about this a little already, but what may have factored into her decision at this point to not take the stand is that if she does, the state can bring up felonies to poke at her credibility. And obviously she has felonies in Idaho. And this issue came up before trial even started. Then the judge said, essentially, well, there wasn't a decision made. We'll kind of cross that bridge when we get there. But he said he was inclined to limit the number of felonies they could introduce. So we don't know what may be brought up at, so there's some considerations there.
Even if you limit it, I mean, if you are...
They're all bad. Yeah.
These are significant felonies
They're all significant.
that she's convicted of.
Yeah, absolutely. So that could be something that plays in. And again, she's representing herself, but she hasn't been sitting alone. She has an investigator and she has public defenders who, would have been her public defenders, but now they're technically her advisory council. So she does, spin around and confer with them at various points.
It truly does seem to me, though, like when you're this jury, that is such a critical element of what the public knows about Lori Vallow Daybell's life, that I really wonder what kind of impact that would have made. If any. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, and that's again, there are very limited opportunities for that door to be opened, and it doesn't sound like we're going to go there, but I would love to hear from this jury after, because I can't imagine sitting through what we've seen of this trial, and then finally, a decision is made, they deliberate, and going to Google this case and be like, oh my goodness, wow, there's so much more to this story. And again, we've heard this throughout, that it feels like, in just the media attention and the packed courtrooms, the jury must know there's more than meets the eye. But again, they can't consider that. They have to be very specific with what they're considering in their deliberations. And those are just some of the instructions we're expecting them to get Monday morning here in Arizona. And then we understand that those closing arguments are scheduled for Monday afternoon.
So that's next week.
That's next week. We have the long weekend to see what may come out of this and see if Lori Vallow Daybell changes her mind, but that's where we're at. And we know this is just one trial of hers in Arizona. She's expected to face another conspiracy to commit murder trial just a few weeks after this case wraps up. So it'll be really interesting. That case, some familiar names we brought up today.
Yeah.
She's accused of conspiring to kill her niece's ex-husband, who is alive.
One thing I wondered, just before I let you go, is there any way that case changes based on the outcome of this one?
Possibly. She may consider not representing herself, but to my understanding, she hasn't been offered a plea deal in either of these cases, but she could possibly change her mind and plead guilty if that's how she feels, if she thinks she is. We don't know that. Again, these are just accusations, but I would imagine with that case, we're going to hear a lot of the same threads that we've heard in this case, this current case with Charles Vallow's murder, and then the murders in Idaho of her kids and Tammy Daybell. So we're expecting, I think more of the same, but it'll be interesting because in that case, we actually have a surviving victim who could possibly take the stand. So certainly a lot more to come in the coming days, but for now, we will focus on what's in front of us, which is closing arguments, and then we'll be on verdict watch when it comes to Lori Vallow Daybell being accused of conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow. And of course, we will be live streaming those proceedings starting Monday on KTVB Plus, as well as 12 Plus. And we will also have a recap on Inside the Courtroom. Thanks for watching.